All right, we can get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's APHA affiliated webinar, The Impacts of War and Conflict on the Well-Being of Refugees. Today's event is co-hosted by the APHA Human Rights Forum and the APHA Peace Caucus. We're so thrilled to have you all with us, and we're really excited to introduce you to our speakers today who have really great presentations for all of you. My name is Celicia Lomax. I am the co-programming chair for the Human Rights Forum and will be one of the moderators for today's session. You'll hear from 4 fantastic speakers and my co-moderator, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But I would like to go over a couple of brief housekeeping items, just so that everyone is aware. As you are entering the Zoom room, we do ask that you remain muted for the duration of the presentations from each of our speakers. We want to make sure that we are respecting their presentation time and what they have to share with us. However, if you do have any questions or comments that you'd like to share, please feel free to use the chat throughout the duration of all of those presentations. We have a set time at the end of all of the presentations to do an audience-based Q&A. So feel free, again, to put those questions in the chat. And we'll also open it up for folks to ask questions verbally if you are interested in that and would like to. We can start off, I guess, just sharing briefly. I think we see everyone here too. And I apologize, as there are still folks coming into the Zoom room. So I want to make sure that they're all receiving okay, great. Folks are coming in. Perfect. So just wanted to share a little bit of background on the Human Rights Forum specifically, and then I will pass over to Annie to talk a little bit about the Peace Caucus before we dive into presentations from our speakers. So for the Human Rights Forum, we know that human rights is inextricably linked to the achievement of public health goals. It's a growing public health field that has arisen in health and human rights, sort of examining the human right to health and how that is interconnected to our rights and underlying determinants of health. So reflective of that rise in the field, what began was the APHA International Human Rights Committee, actually started in 1983. As an appointed committee through the APHA Executive Board, and working over about 3 decades, then the Human Rights Forum began. And so it sort of represents the next chapter in APHA's leading role in championing the cause of human rights and public health, increasing the overall APHA membership, sort of focused on rights-related issues in mainstreaming rights in public health practice. Today, the APHA Human Rights Forum has over 1,000 members within its overall membership, and sponsors a poster session and 4 scientific sessions during the APHA annual meeting. So we would definitely look forward to seeing any and all of you there. So that's a little bit on the Human Rights Forum. You're welcome to join it. It is completely free for members to be a part of. There's a new newsletter that comes out for folks quarterly if you're interested in seeing that. And again, we really look forward also to today's presentations. So I will pass it over to my colleague Annie to give a brief introduction of herself and the Peace Caucus.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ann Lancini, and I'm a co-program planner with the APHA Peace Caucus. The Peace Caucus was founded in 1985 to educate and promote the influential voice of public health professionals in building peace. We strive to illuminate that peace and social justice are key determinants of health across the globe, and we do that through many different outreach and educational activities, including webinars like this. Peace Caucus members engage in a variety of activities. We organize scientific programs at APHA's annual meeting, which is the next one is coming up in November. We develop policies, disseminate information, and conduct other activities that highlight the public health impacts of war, conflict, and other forms of violence, and especially the essential role of health professionals in prevention. There'll be a little more at the end of our presentation about how to get involved. And with that, I'll hand it back to Celicia to introduce our next presenter.
All right, so thank you so much, Annie. And with that, I am going to be introducing our first speaker for today's presentations, Ms. Catherine Chon. She's the founding director of the Office on Trafficking in Persons and senior advisor. Oops. Oh, perfect. I just realized that those came up. And senior advisor on human trafficking at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. As director, Catherine leads the office and determines certification and eligibility for survivors of human trafficking who may be eligible for refugee benefits and services. She is the federal executive director of the National Advisory Committee on the Sex Trafficking of Children and Youth in the U.S. As senior advisor, Catherine serves on multiple committees under the Senior Policy Operating Group of the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. She serves on other related federal interagency working groups on violence against women, child exploitation, and Native American affairs. Prior to her governmental service, Catherine was the co-founder and president of Polaris, establishing the global organization's innovative programs to assist survivors of human trafficking, expand anti-trafficking policies, and fundamentally change the way local communities respond to modern slavery. So with that, we are so excited to have you with us, Catherine. We will pass it over to you. Oh, and Catherine, it looks like you are muted and I think your presentation just went away on us.
Hi, everyone. I just had a technical difficulty, but can you see the slides?
It looks like it's still loading for.
Celicia, are this?
Yep.
Say that again?
We now have them up. We can see them. Thank you.
Oops. Okay. Great. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Today, my presentation will focus on human trafficking and the intersections with war, conflict, and climate change on the well-being of refugees. So first, just starting off with our office overview.
Sorry about that. I think we may have been having a little bit of technical difficulties with Catherine. Just give us one moment. We're going to see if she can join us back in 1 second.
In the meantime, we'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Rohini Haar. Dr. Haar is an emergency physician with expertise in health and human rights. Her work focuses on the protection of human rights in times of complex humanitarian crises and conflict, and she is particularly interested in the protection of health workers and health services. As an emergency medical physician, she has worked both as academic emergency medicine faculty in New York City and Oakland, as well as on numerous international projects, including in Haiti, Senegal, Ghana, Morocco, Palestine, Israel, India, and the Thai-Burma border. She's also a research fellow at the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley School of Law and works clinically at Kaiser Medical Center in Oakland, California. Dr. Haar also serves on the board of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Dr. Haar's research interests include studying the impact of human rights violations, such as violations of free speech and assembly, and war crimes on health.
Thanks, Anlin. That bio makes me sound busier than I probably am. I wanted to talk today about protecting health in times of war, and I'll just go and hopefully Catherine can join us right afterwards. And I will call out that I see that my colleague and mentor, Len Rubenstein's on the call too, so hopefully I get it right, Len. So let me start here. This is a picture of an archaeological site in Raqqa, Syria. And a number of years ago, I met a doctor there who is now a close colleague, and he was okay with me sharing his story and his name with you. His name is Dr. Nasser, and he's a general surgeon. And after the Arab Spring protests that rocked Syria in 2011, he was attacked by police, because he was in Raqqa, who would target healthcare workers for just caring for protesters. In 2013, he was conscripted into military service, but his conscience forbade him from participating in the military. So he left his home and his job. He worked elsewhere, and then in 2014, airstrikes were falling all over northern Syria, making working in the hospitals very dangerous. And soon after that, ISIS took over Raqqa, and not only were there airstrikes, but ISIS soldiers demanded priority treatment and strict adherence to their laws. He had to leave, but some of his family stayed and suffered again when the United States bombed Raqqa to rout out ISIS. And today he lives in Syria, where he works with me on research and with Len, but he can't work as a physician, which is really his true passion. And this is what he wrote to me one day when I was asking him how he was doing. He said, "Staying anywhere in Syria was a death sentence. It was hard enough to work long hours for continuous days, managing the trauma of my people with minimal supplies, but doing all that with no security was an impossible situation. I left my country, my family, and my beloved profession." And today, I'd like to share that story for two reasons, and really to make 2 points. One is to give a human face to what health in conflict settings really looks like, and amplify and uplift the voices of the individuals who are experiencing it. And the second is to illustrate the complexity of violence against healthcare. Now, sometimes it can be airstrikes like what we've seen in Syria for nearly 10 years, and now in Ukraine with, I think, something over 400 attacks on hospitals. But sometimes it can be threats or intimidation, like what we're seeing in Myanmar, or confiscating medications, or occupying a hospital, or blocking access for some, or even trying to influence triage decisions. Anytime that healthcare has outside influences, even in peacetime, it can be bad for patients, health workers, really the entire community. So my hope today is to share with you 2 main points and then back them up and explain them a little. The first is that we must see the problem to work on solving it. And if we don't see it as a problem, if we don't see how big it is, it's really hard to work on it at all. And the second is that violence on health has impacts far beyond the immediate. So seeing the problem can take several forms. It means hearing the voices of health workers and patients who have experienced this violence. A colleague in Syria shared this. But then the airstrikes began. It was clear from the sky that this was a medical facility, but it didn't matter to anyone. We tried to put people in the basement, but bombs can damage everything, and people didn't feel safe anywhere. A colleague in Sudan wrote this one day. "If I am completely honest, every time I participated in the protests, I was terrified that something would happen to me because I'm a doctor. But I didn't want to be selfish. I wanted to participate because I believed in what's right for my country." Seeing the problem can also look at what my colleagues at the Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition and Insecurity Insight do on a day-to-day basis. Many organizations work on collecting data in conflict settings to really understand the scope and scale. It can mean counting incidents and mapping them. This graphic is from a report we wrote in May of this year. There was 43 countries with violence against healthcare and more than 1,000 unique incidents. It can mean understanding what each incident does to the community and its impacts with qualitative research or interviews. It means identifying and naming perpetrators because we really need to know what's going on and who's doing it. And it can mean sending that information to the media, to policymakers, to investigators, to lawyers. As an example of the research, this graphic uses data from a group we're very close with, Physicians for Human Rights, on attacks on health. And you can see the attacks on health are the red line. The other line, the blue bars, are civilian casualties that were recorded publicly as well. Now, if you just looked at the civilian casualties, it looks like it's really bad in 2012 and then sort of tapers down and flattens off. That's only one way to see what's really going on. If you look at the red line of actual attacks on healthcare, you can see that there was really no tapering off in 2015, 2016. And so really, the attacks continued, and it paints a picture of conflict intensity that can tell you that looking at one measure of violence doesn't tell the whole story. This is from another study we did last year. We used publicly available information from a group called Air Wars in England and from Insecurity Insight in Geneva to look at civilian violence in Syria to identify perpetrators, not of just one attack or something, but really at the trends. And you can see in the purple circles here that Russia is associated strongly with civilian violence in Aleppo in 2016, and the Syrian government with violence directly targeted at healthcare. But up there in the corner, you can see the United States is not off the hook. Our airstrikes on Raqqa in 2017 resulted in intense civilian casualties. This is all just to briefly say that studying and understanding a problem means lots of things. It can mean documenting, reporting, characterizing, investigating, and that's what researchers do all the time. Why? Well, when something bad happens, what do we want to do about it? We want to catch the bad guy. We want to help the victims and the survivors. And we want to make sure it doesn't happen again. In more formal terms, I would call that promoting accountability, prioritizing resources to those most in need, and preventing atrocities in the first place by really exposing how bad they are. The second point I wanted to make is that violence on health has impacts far beyond the immediate. When we think of a bombed hospital, yes, that's terrible, and there's lots of people who get hurt or injured in the immediate, but in the long run, it's far more chilling. There's breakdown of a health infrastructure. You can really decrease the limited health service capacities, and ultimately there could be a chilling effect and fear of health-seeking services. Not to belabor the point, but I'll just give you one example from our work. Between 2001 and 2011, there were 11 reported cases of measles in Syria. 11 cases. But from 2011 to 2015, the health system was in tatters, even with reporting being terrible. And then when they finally started collecting data between 2015 and 2019, the AA Assistance Coordination Unit in Syria documented 30,000 cases of measles. The chilling effect of attacks on health is hard to measure, but really obvious to anyone. When one hospital is attacked and there's no accountability, patients or potential patients are naturally going to fear going to any of the hospitals. And the balance changes on whether going to the hospital is worth it or not, unless it's dire. So a lot of folks just won't seek healthcare. So I've painted a dark picture. How do we do better? I think we have a fragile window of opportunity even now. The attention that Russia's attacks on health in Ukraine has brought is unique. As I mentioned, I think there's been over 400 verified incidents, which The WHO has even reported, as a member state organization, that's gutsy, we have more data than ever to identify, verify, and report these attacks. The satellite technology allows us to see more from far away, better than ever, in real time. Media monitoring of folks who are on the ground and posting stuff on social media allows us to get kind of closer and at the same time see a broader scope of what's being attacked. And to be honest, the strengthening decolonization movement begs us to empower local health workers to engage in humanitarian advocacy and report their own stories. Our goal as researchers is to support their work and amplify their voices. So as you think about violence against healthcare, and hopefully I've presented a presentation that shows you that this is a very important issue to think about, I hope it draws you deeper into the issue and underscores all the other places where wars are currently happening and where healthcare needs more protection. I urge you to think about those wars, as well as the wars and their impacts on health in Ethiopia, Yemen, and Mexico and elsewhere, that we don't talk about every day. Thank you. I'll just end by saying it really takes a team to be a thorn on the side of injustice. So I really appreciate you inviting me. And I just want to thank everyone on my research teams that works on these things.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rohini. It was great to hear your perspective and your work in this area. I think, especially as some folks may have thought broadly about violence against citizens, but not necessarily against healthcare workers in particular. So we applaud your work and very much appreciate you sharing with us. We're going to move on to our next speaker, which is Dr. Robert Marlin. I will give a brief introduction on him and then we will move on to his. So Dr. Marlin is a primary care internist and a medical anthropologist. He's currently the chief of the Meta Health Center at the Lowell Community Health Center in Lowell, Massachusetts, a multidisciplinary program serving the health needs of refugees, torture survivors, and asylum seekers in the Merrimack Valley. For the past 2 decades, he has advocated for the health and healthcare needs of underserved populations. His research has included projects on the gendered experience of violence and armed conflict in Southern Africa, the reception of unauthorized immigrants in healthcare settings in Massachusetts, and the effects of access to health IT resources on the health outcomes of limited English proficient patients. He previously served as the founding director of the Coordinated Care Program for Political Violence Survivors at the Cambridge Health Alliance. His interests include refugee health and the development of integrated models of community-based care for underserved populations. He teaches refugee healthcare to medical students at the University of Massachusetts Chan School of Medicine and previously served on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. So, Dr. Robert Marlin, we would love to have you.
Thank you, Celicia. I want to make sure you can see my screen.
I think we can, but we do not have the slides here yet.
So what do you see?
We see I think this is a Google Doc, maybe with your slide.
Oh, then let's see if we can switch that. Stop sharing for a second. Let's see. Do you see slides now?
Not yet.
Not
No.
yet. Hold on 1 second. Working before. You know, if you have them easily accessible, if you want to bring the slides up, we could do that so as not to lose time.
Let's see if I can pull this up. All right. Can everyone see this? All right. All right, Dr. Marlin, you can just let me know when to go on to the next slide.
Sure. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to get back to where I was. Let's see here. Updates. See, just lost access to my slide. 1 second. Sorry about that. I can find another way. There we go. Okay. So you can go on to the next slide. So I have no disclosures to offer. Next slide. So I think any discussion of refugee health should always start by reviewing the definition of what a refugee is. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with this, but I always find it a touchstone, an important point to come back to. So the UN defines a refugee as someone who's unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And of course, that's from the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. So the definition itself is the key to differential treatment of displaced persons, both around the world and in the United States, and really comes out of the context of the Cold War. We often think of it as progressive, but there's definite issues with this. We go on to the next slide. So although the UN High Commissioner for Refugees focuses on refugees, the largest number of forcibly displaced persons around the world are those who are internally displaced. So these are same kind of people experiencing the same kind of violence, but they don't cross a border. So they've not crossed the border, and therefore they don't meet the criteria to be considered refugees or to be eligible for many of the services that refugees are. And when we want to diminish or dismiss our obligation to those who have been forcibly displaced, as we often do with many of them in the US, we simply refer to them as immigrants, those who have apparently moved away from their country of birth or usual residence of their own free will, as if they hadn't experienced any violence at all. In case after case, we use these definitions to artificially separate and grade suffering fellow humans. So why should an IDP, an internally displaced person in the Democratic Republic of Congo or Syria, be treated differently than someone who flees the same violence, the same conflict, but manages to cross a border into Rwanda or Turkey? These different legal statuses also provide different access to health coverage and health services. In the US context, one has to ask, why is there a difference between Haitians who have fled environments of political and economic violence in Haiti, Chile, or Brazil, Ukrainians who have been bombed out of their homes and forced into neighboring or distant countries, and those who fled Burma or Cuba due to political opposition and torture? Next slide, please. So for many years, we kept large-scale refugee populations separate in camps, whether at Dadaab in Kenya, this is an image of Dadaab, one of the Dadaab camps, or at Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, in part to keep them separate from the host nation's population. For the purposes ostensibly of public health, from the host nation's perspective, in these contexts, they don't, the refugees don't have access to healthcare. They don't have access to the health systems of the host country, nor to other resources that citizens do. Next slide. Then we saw the movement to urban refugee settlement, such as in Uganda or Lebanon or Turkey, that many of you may be familiar with, where they were also made invisible to the world, but in plain sight, and given only limited access to resources, again, often barred from accessing national services, including healthcare. And there's many other cases, Jordan, other places. So we use terminology to winnow down our obligations to those who've experienced violence in war. Health professionals, both clinicians and public health professionals, must fight against these differentiations and argue for all of these populations and individuals affected by violence, experiencing human rights violations, to be treated equitably and with dignity. The role of health professionals must be as witnesses to the effects of war, advocates for the prevention of war and conflict, and to ensure that refugees and others affected by large-scale violence are provided with the resources they need to be made whole and recover their health, including their mental health. So if we make invisible the results of war and conflict and the refugees and others directly affected by it, we'll not be able to prevent it or resolve it. A primary role for health professionals beyond direct clinical care or public health program provision must be advocacy. Health professionals are uniquely qualified as witnesses to the effects of war and conflict on both large populations and individuals, and enjoy a natural position of trust from which to speak to the world on this topic. Next slide. So health professionals also recognize the synergistic vulnerabilities created by climate change and war. They've watched for decades as drought and other disasters have created new waves of human displacement, disease, and suffering, and many now count climate change as a risk for poor health outcomes for populations worldwide. Now they need to make clear to the world the nexus of climate change, refugee movements, and disease. Already vulnerable to armed conflict, health professionals are watching the disintegrating climate, food, and health crises take place in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen, as Russia's war on Ukraine tips all three of these countries into famine and further disintegration. Next slide. So how do we care for refugees once it's determined that care is warranted? First, in the international context, refugees are designated by the UN and host nations together, crossing borders for access to benefits and often life-saving services. Whether in camps or urban areas, refugees typically receive health services, including medical care and sanitation services from both UN agencies and contracted humanitarian actors. In many cases, refugees can remain in these situations, for decades, or in the case of some large camps and protracted conflicts, for generations, with the health effects of such conditions compounding over time with each subsequent generation. Only a tiny fraction of refugees will be designated for resettlement in a third country. When this is the case, they have to go through intensive health screenings. Most refugees, however, will be returned to their country of origin. Some will go on to be refugees again due to future conflicts. For those who do come to the US, go on to the next slide, sorry. For those who do come to the US, it's only after a long chain of involvement with international organizations, including the UN, national bodies like the CDC, the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, national resettlement agencies, their local partners in the states, state departments of public health, and healthcare organizations or local health departments who actually evaluate refugees clinically when they arrive, and they finally have a chance to settle. For those fortunate enough to be brought into the US as refugees or to be eventually granted asylum by proving themselves after arrival to warrant a designation as a refugee, they're provided access to healthcare services and other public resources for a very limited amount of time. And this differs radically by states. And they're provided a pathway to be able to struggle for the same healthcare along with the majority of those in the US. They suffer the same lack of access to mental health care as the rest of the US population, and often are further limited by language access, with most clinicians only offering care in English. In limited cases, they may find access to clinicians trained in trauma-informed care if they're fortunate. There are specialized centers and programs that provide dedicated services for refugees and others who have fled violence and armed conflict. And I'm very fortunate to work at one such center. But just as in the global context, most refugees and others fleeing violence will not have access to such dedicated specialized services. There's also no mandate for the provision of such care or adequate resources to support this. While refugees and others fleeing violence will therefore seek care within the general healthcare system in the US, this system is not at all prepared to meet their needs, as we don't train primary care or other clinicians to meet the specific needs of this population. At least in public health, we have an awareness of this population and their needs, but are often unable to meet these due to the politics surrounding refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers in the US. For 4 years during the previous presidential administration, the infrastructure to receive and care for refugees in the US was systematically hollowed out and defunded. The knowledge and resources that had been developed in the wake of record-breaking large numbers of refugee arrivals during the administration that preceded it now atrophied or disappeared completely, as the new administration brought the number of refugees arriving in the US to an all-time low. Moreover, refugees, as well as asylum seekers and immigrants, were publicly vilified as detrimental to the well-being of the country, along with those advocating for them, including health professionals. All of these issues were further exacerbated, as many of you know, by the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, which made accessing care even more challenging for refugees. Now that the new administration has rapidly and substantially raised the number of refugees allowed into the country, the entire care continuum for refugees has had to attempt to rebuild itself as fast as possible while still feeling the losses of the previous 4 years. So in sum, only through the concerted advocacy of health professionals can we hope to simultaneously expand access to services needed by this population and training opportunities for those who wish to care for them. Next slide. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Marlin. Annie, I'll actually pass over to you to present our next speaker.
Absolutely. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Shelley White. Dr. White is Associate Professor and Chair of Public Health at Simmons University and serves as Program Director of the Master of Public Health and Health Equity. Her research focuses on social movements and social justice, the politics of health and health policy, and socio-structural determinants of health, including the influences of corporations, trade, militarism, borders, and social inequities on health. Shelley has worked in global health, including in HIV/AIDS programming and policy work in the US and Southern Africa, community development in South America and Eastern Africa, and migration and environmental justice along the U.S. Mexico border. She founded the Public Health Working Group for Primary Prevention of War in 2011, which is an international collective of public health academics, practitioners, and activists that has spurred curricular innovation and frameworks for teaching, activist academic collaborations, and various publications, for which she was awarded the 2019 Sidel Levy Peace Award for Peace from APHA. Go ahead, Shelley.
Thank you so much, Annie and Celicia and all here on the panel. Really appreciate being a part of this important event. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can folks see these slides now?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. Well, my name is Shelley White. As Annie said, I teach at Simmons University and Director of Master of Public Health and Health Equity. And the upstream orientation of this MPH program is something you'll see reflected in my talk today. I also want to share that I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And I just want to thank the previous presenters, Dr. Haar, speaking to our need to see a problem in order to tackle it, which is so essential in this work. And likewise, Dr. Marlin for speaking to the ways that, the terminologies we use and the ways that we define folks in need, particularly through these othering frames, the way that then winnows down our obligations to them rhetorically. And so there's a lot of framing that really goes into the importance of our work as public health professionals. I'm going to speak today about my work in the U.S. Mexico borderlands. in Southern Arizona, where I've been teaching immersion and youth justice courses over the past 7 years, and spent the better part of the last 2 years completing ethnographic action research with organizations here and elsewhere along the borderlands, about half a dozen organizations engaged in migration justice, environmental justice, and educational justice. We're asking today about the well-being of refugees in the context of war and conflict, and about the possibilities of primary prevention. So I'd like to begin with that concept, but the landscape of these borderlands pictured here already says a lot, doesn't it? It recalls Gloria Anzaldua's work and poetry defining this border as an open wound, which scars the earth and runs the length of her body. About 10 years ago, as Annie mentioned, I started a working group through the Peace Caucus that focuses on primary prevention of war. So why? The Peace Caucus and many in public health have had a long and proud history of working to promote peace and prevent the health impacts of war. Still, as I looked at the ways public health had trended toward the behavioral approach, I saw us slipping from our roots of actually preventing poor health from a structural perspective. With Doctors Bernard Lown and John Brody, I completed a study of the full curricular offerings of the top 20 schools of public health. We surveyed over 6,000 course listings and found that only 128 of those courses were war-related. And within those, 17 presented preventive themes, of which only 4 touched on primary prevention. So we were documenting the general dearth of attention to war itself as an important determinant of health. And moreover, that when public health does pay attention, it's often engaged in the aftermath effects rather than considering how we might prevent war, or dare ask ourselves how we might prevent militarism itself, right? The predeterminant of war, which in essence is this unquestioned, almost unquestionable societal preparation for the reality of war, actually as a normal and desirable activity. So what would it look like if public health were questioning war from the get-go before it happened, and more so militarism itself as the normalcy of our society, particularly for those of us who are US based. Over the past 10 years, we've published various articles and frameworks for teaching and researching war and conflict and militarism through a primary preventive lens, and published an edited volume through our collaborative efforts, and those references are at the end of this presentation. This work does not discount the importance of secondary and tertiary prevention, which respond to ill health once those processes have started. When people are hurting and we've created the conditions that spur refugee crises, we must act. But we also need to ask ourselves how we can use our voice uniquely in public health to call attention to the upstream determinants of war, conflict, and militarism itself. And I must emphasize that this is an inherently political project, both small p and big P. And there are some great studies actually documenting public health's reticence to engage the political. I want to quote Lynn Friedman, an awesome human rights legal scholar who critiques our behavioral slide, stating, and I quote, "The decision to focus on individual behavior to the exclusion of other social determinants of ill health is a political choice," her emphasis. And it is not an inescapable answer compelled by an indisputable, scientifically correct understanding of disease causation, end quote. To question militarism, we need to question military spending, structural racism, and dirty trade and corporate policies. This work is inherently political, inherently uncomfortable, and very much our job as public health professionals. So like all structural analyses of health inequity, our job is to peel the onion, to dig deeper, and to question unapologetically. In my program, in the words of Dr. Joyce Bell, we employ our students that their analyses must be structural, historical, and critical, necessarily so, and every time if we're going to be looking upstream. Or in the words of Dr. Paul Farmer, one of my great heroes, we ask that their analyses be, and I quote, historically deep and geographically broad if we're going to trace these elements of causation. This is just the approach we need to understand refugee well-being and the possibilities of primary prevention in the borderlands, which I'll turn to now. Due to the limits of time, I want to quickly orient you to the region where I work, which is right on that corner of Arizona that you see there on the map. Humane Borders has annually updated this death map to illustrate what is happening in the desert that transects the middle third of Arizona's southern border in this tri-national landscape between the U.S., Mexico, and the Tohono O'odham Nation. And I want to point out that all of this land was, of course, Mexico once. Nearly 4,000 deaths have been recorded since 2000, and these are known deaths only. We know that because of the desert conditions here, many human remains are never found, well documented by the University of Arizona. The preponderance of deaths in this desert has been called the, quote, funnel effect, which began on the heels of 1990s era border militarization that clamped down crossing in California and Texas, funneling migrants, including asylum seekers, into more and more dangerous terrain. Well, this is part of U.S. federal policy's stated policy, prevention through deterrence. These are planned deaths as part of our federal and ongoing policy since the 1990s. While there are official points of entry along this border, people are crossing unsanctioned. And of course, our popular media, to get back to that framing, and many politicians like to ask, why don't people just cross the right way? Why? We have made it nearly impossible for them to do so, as Dr. Marlin spoke to, until very recently, and then caused major bottleneck. With too many factors to discuss, I want to just turn back a couple pages of history for us to consider. During the last presidency, we saw some of the greatest violations of human rights in border policy. Zero tolerance, piloted in 2017 and announced in May of 2018. Zero tolerance resulted in the separation of over 5,000 children from their parents, and over 500 still had lost parents as of October 2020. Children as young as infants were separated at the border. Remain in Mexico. This is the so-called Migrant Protection Protocol, speaking of euphemisms and framings, which turned asylum seekers back at ports of entry to await processing in Mexico, often in quite unfamiliar territory and dangerous circumstances, very often in the places where they did not cross or have contacts. This led to over 60,000 migrants being stuck at the border by March 2020, just in time for COVID. And just then, of course, processing of migrants, including asylum seekers, stopped. The Biden administration repealed this, was forced by the Supreme Court to reinstate it, and finally ended the policy again, just in June of 2022. We have weaponized COVID. Title 42 of the U.S. Public Health Service Act, last invoked in 1929, was invoked to turn away migrants, including asylum seekers, due to COVID. We could turn back folks in any place, from any place of the world where COVID was endemic. I think you all know, many of us from public health, it was endemic everywhere, right, at that point in time, including here. So what a twist in the way we're talking about public health. In the first 2 years, 1.8 million expulsions took place, including of refugees. Human Rights First tracked that over 10,000 instances occurred as a direct result of this policy of murder, kidnapping, rape, and torture. And I know hopefully we'll hear from Catherine about the instances of trafficking that resulted as well as a result. Each one of these policy initiatives represented windows to advance primary prevention. While there were important actions by some in public health, the lack of a unified voice from public health was notable. For instance, APHA issued a policy statement on family separations, but not targeting these other very important policies that were very much affecting the flow and possibilities for refugees. And in addition to advocating the rolling back of these policies, we need to be advocating for just policies much more holistically to regain ground at our US borders for the rights and well-being of all migrants, including refugees. Taking a few steps back in history, there are an abundance of opportunities we've had in primary prevention at this border as it relates to migrant and refugee health. And we have been losing out to racist xenophobia and nationalism, neoliberal economics, and dirty wars that served US interests. We didn't have any walls to speak of along this border until 1990. That's recent history in my book. There was a vibrancy of circular migration that served twin cities like El Paso and Juarez that have since seen economic decline since the wall came in. The first militarized wall was built in the San Diego district, this piece right here, my first encounter with it when I was in my 20s. And this extends well into the Pacific Ocean. It was a corrugated metal fence that necessarily caused drownings and other tragedies. My introduction to this wall. A series of operations in the 1990s tipped off this era of border militarization, and I must point out that this is not a partisan issue. Democrats and Republicans have created this mess together. Walls and infrastructure were built, supplemented by troops on the ground and massive systems of technological surveillance. Please read Operation Gatekeeper by Nevins or anything by Todd Miller for further history. We've seen an explosion of spending. Border Patrol increased its budget 18 times over 2 decades, and ICE doubled its since its inception post 9/11. We have over 80,000 people employed in this border militarization project. And as you probably recall from the Trump era, this doesn't even include the private contractors who've been hired to erect and replace walls at a taxpayer cost of 20 to 25 million per square mile. Some of it cutting straight through the Tohono O'odham Nation's sacred territories and springs. We can't ignore the confluence of tipping off border militarization with a concurrent push to open our border to goods. We passed NAFTA the same year as we passed Operation Gatekeeper, pushing to liberalize redefined barriers to trade, which included now public health measures and protections and environmental protections, privatize all sectors and privilege multinationals. US-driven policy contributed to the collapse of Mexico's peso, precipitating a wave of economic refugees. We can't ignore the role of our US Army, particularly its little-known School of the Americas, which trained generations of dictators, not included on this list, Saddam Hussein, particularly across, though, Central and South America, perhaps most famously linked to the massacres of nuns and priests, including Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador in the early 1980s. US policy has contributed to a tortured wave of political refugees. Deforestation is just one environmental crisis facing our comrades in the global South. The first image presented at COP26 shows the extent of that. The second helps us to think upstream, helps us to question how US-driven policies in the interests of multinationals continue to contribute to the present and forthcoming wave of environmental refugees. When I was teaching my MPH course in Northern Ecuador, visiting indigenous communities amid the oil fields first established by Texaco Chevron in the 70s, learning about the open burning, ongoing spills along extensive clusters of cancer, respiratory disease, miscarriage, and other ailments still ongoing, I was unsurprised to learn that those many folks there were going to undertake the tremendous risk and treacherous journey north to try for a better future at our US border. What we know at this point is that based on the current political, social, economic, and environmental context of the US Mexico border, suffering and deaths will continue. What we can do with our voices as public health professionals is to place responsibility squarely where it belongs and to raise the level of analysis to question the very project of border militarization, juxtaposed with other US policies that are necessitating refugee and migrant crises. This is the work of primary prevention. It is very closely aligned with the work of advancing health equity. And I thank you. I want to say that we should always do this work following the lead of local organizers and activists who've been at this tirelessly, who've been criminalized for their tireless work, and could use the true partnership of professionals who are willing to humbly offer their resources, research, and access to public audiences. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for the fantastic presentation, especially in thinking about primary prevention and our militarization in the borders. We are going to go to our last speaker. Catherine Sean will come back to from the Office on Trafficking in Persons within the Department of Health and Human Services.
All right, thank you, everyone. Sorry for all the technical difficulties. I'll dive Straight in, I'm here representing the Health and Human Services response to human trafficking, which is part of an all of federal government response where we focus on strengthening prevention and meeting the public health needs related to human trafficking. So first, just a very basic overview. When we're talking about human trafficking, we're primarily talking about two forms. There's labor trafficking, which is in essence, any aspect of forced labor, and then sex trafficking, where there is some type of um, uh, exchange for commercial sex involving men, women, and children. And in terms of what the Department of Health and Human Services does in this area, uh, the primary core of our work is to fund health and human service programming to meet the needs of survivors of human trafficking and their families. We have a lot that we're doing around data and policy to build the evidence base around preventing human trafficking, and then also incorporating human trafficking into primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention efforts across the department and with other federal agencies. So I wanted to first start off with just some examples in the context of Ukrainian refugees in the war and conflict there, as well as climate refugees and some of the intersections with human trafficking in disaster responses and natural disasters. So the first thing I wanted to mention is some statistics related specifically to Ukrainian refugees. These are statistics out of the International Organization for Migration, their mission in Ukraine. And last year, they assisted over 1,000 victims of human trafficking. This is labor and sex trafficking impacting men, women, and children. And then they also funded a survey and identified that there were an estimated 46,000 Ukrainians who were impacted by human trafficking from 2019 to 2021. So all that to say, even prior to war and conflict, human trafficking is a pre-existing situation and human rights abuse. And then whenever there are disruptions such as natural disasters, war, conflict, and mass migration, many of the underlying risk factors tend to get exacerbated. And then they, for this particular survey, they identified that about 18% of the respondents were ready to accept informal and risky job offers abroad. And then there have been more anecdotes in terms of how traffickers have been using fraudulent online recruitment schemes or in-person schemes through the shelter networks as Ukrainian refugees have been looking for safety and support. So some common risk factors include family separation, conflict-related sexual violence, and loss of income. And you can find additional information from the UN and the International Organization for Migration. The other thing I wanted to point out from a multilateral perspective is the OSCE, which is a multilateral body of countries in Europe and then inclusive of the United States. They recently came out with a public awareness campaign called the Be Safe campaign for Ukrainian refugees, given the increased reports of human trafficking, recruitment, and victimization. And I provided the site here where they go through in detail on how refugees and service providers and healthcare providers can spot the warning signs of some of the most commonly used trafficking recruitment schemes, different strategies to minimize the risks for trafficking, and where to go to for help if someone has experienced trafficking, exploitation, and victimization. And then here in the United States, the Department of Homeland Security oversees the United for Ukraine parole process. So essentially what this does is enable US citizens to act as, or to be sponsors for Ukrainian refugees. And there's a whole process for sponsors to go through. And then it also enables Ukrainian refugees to stay in the US temporarily up to 2 years. And then there are various services and benefits attached to that. And the importance of the support is to try to prevent well, many other forms of exploitation, including human trafficking, by minimizing the risks and increasing the support and resilience factors. And there's more information there, and happy to answer any questions in the US context. So quickly shifting into natural disasters, and I just wanted to give some examples from 2004 to 2011. We were tracking where were there the risk factors and the particular, how was human trafficking manifesting in terms of its schemes and trends. And so, for example, even back to 2004, the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, there were increased reports of not just trafficking, but sexual violence, physical abuse, increased reports of child soldiers. And then this was reported in multiple countries, including India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. And then here within the US, in the context of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, I remember at that time, I was providing direct services in Washington, D.C., and one of our local cases of human trafficking involved a teenage girl who was in a shelter, displaced from her home in New Orleans, in a shelter, and then a trafficker had recruited her under a trafficking scheme, brought her to Washington, D.C., and then she was exploited in a sex trafficking scheme. And it just points to how targeted human traffickers are when they're looking for vulnerability, risk factors, people who are disconnected from their family or typical sources of support in the community. And during Hurricane Katrina, there were increased reports of domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as forced labor and labor trafficking in the debris cleanup and the rebuilding process. There were major civil suits that were won regarding workers who were here on guest worker visas and then forced to engage in various forms of labor in the rebuilding. 2010, the earthquake in Haiti, increased displacement and homelessness. There were increased reports of sex trafficking in the temporary housing facilities. And then in 2011, in the earthquake and tsunami that impacted Japan and Fukushima, there was this notion or reports of quote unquote nuclear gypsies where there were advertisements, particularly for older people to help with the cleanup efforts after the disaster. There were black market recruitment ads for people who were experiencing homelessness. And then many of the workers were forced to sign these agreements waiving their rights related to any radiation poisoning. So again, depending on the location and the context, whether it was internally displaced persons or those who had crossed borders, state borders, local borders, various forms of trafficking emerged. And so I also wanted to point out some resources. We are in the thick of National Preparedness Month, and HHS is contributing to that. There are some very specific resources we have at the intersection of human trafficking and emergency preparedness and disaster response. There's online training that you see here on this slide. There's a report on what subject matter experts and those with lived experience were recommending on both the intervention and prevention aspects. And then there are also fact sheets on what disaster responders need to know and need to do in the context of identifying and responding to human trafficking. And then we'll be providing more resources later this month. So if you'd like, you can follow us on our LinkedIn page where we post our announcements in real time. And then just shifting gears to unaccompanied children. And this is where I wanted to add to what Shelley was saying about some of the important work that's being done by public health professionals along the southern border. One of our major responsibilities at the Office on Trafficking in Persons is to determine whether foreign national children, including unaccompanied children, have experienced human trafficking in home country, in transit, or here in the United States. And I wanted to quickly just share some high-level overview of what we've been finding over the last 2 decades. So when there is any foreign national minor, including unaccompanied children, who is present in the United States, a attorney, a healthcare provider, any advocate can request assistance from the Department of Health and Human Services so that the minor is eligible for refugee benefits and services. So they don't have refugee status, but they can benefit from all the services that refugees are able to access with one of our eligibility letters. And we highly recommend that healthcare professionals in the public health field know about this process, because it provides a significant amount of support for national children. So you'll see over the course of 2 decades, most of the letters were issued for children, unaccompanied children who've experienced labor trafficking, at 69%, sex trafficking, or in some cases, children have experienced both labor and sex trafficking. And the labor trafficking has ranged from forced labor in different formal, informal sectors, whether it's agriculture, manufacturing, and then increasingly over the more recent or decade, reports of forced criminality, where children are induced into labor trafficking by criminal organizations, organized crime. Family facilitated trafficking was another substantive area of, or a type of human trafficking. And then more boys and girls have reported experiencing human trafficking. And the majority of the incident reports of human trafficking have come from unaccompanied children in the Northern Triangle. And then on the slide, you'll see the non-Northern Triangle countries make up about 23%. And then by reports received, the top 5 countries of origin for unaccompanied children who've experienced trafficking are Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, and China. And I really appreciated, Shelley, what you were saying of when we're looking at any of these issues, whether it's the unaccompanied children part, conflict, climate change, refugees, the importance of also looking at the legacies of historical policies and past conflicts that then contribute to the social and economic conditions that we see present day. And when the majority of these children are asked, what brought you to the United States? Many of them go through very dangerous journeys to get here. The majority of the reason was violence in the home, violence in the community, the economic insecurities that they face in home country and in transit. And then some resources for anyone who's interested in doing a deeper dive in this area. We have information on how healthcare, or anyone, including healthcare providers, can report concerns, request assistance on behalf of trafficking victims, and there are trainings and additional information on our website. And there is how you can contact us online, and also particularly for anyone working with foreign national minors, please reach out to our child protection specialists who can get you plugged into this request process and then connect children to services. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and to all our other speakers for great presentations. We'll move into Q&A for the remainder of the presentation. We have one question to start us off from Manjareen about funding. They found it difficult to find grants to work with the populations we've heard discussed today, and they're wondering if speakers have had any success in finding funding to work with these groups. Feel free to unmute yourselves, speakers?
I would just say
I will
it,
say
it
I
can be
have-
difficult to find federal funding for small communities that you're working with. I would try to look more locally and don't count out foundations, family foundations, especially in your area. Many are very interested in this population, and they're also looking for an entree to working with researchers. So I would make use of that resource. Sorry.
Rohini, did you wanna take-
One thing I'll add to Rob's comment around federal funding is we recognize so much of the work is happening at the smaller community-based organizations in at the local level. And so at the Office on Trafficking in Persons, we created a funding mechanism called the traffic, at least in the context of trafficking and those working with populations in the US, the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, where there's a national grant provider, and then any local organization can sub-enroll at any point to then draw down funding for the organization's administrative costs, as well as the direct service needs of program participants, so healthcare, food, shelter, and I'll put some information in the chat about that grant program, but that would enable the smaller organizations to still draw down on federal funding without having to go through the bureaucratic process of being a prime grant recipient.
One last thing I'll say to that is NIH is not the only division of HHS that offers funding. ACF, where Catherine is a great resource. You have to think of it differently. They're not going to fund an R01, but they do fund work with these populations. So you might want to consider that.
And I would just add that from the primary preventive perspective, our working group, over 10 years really looked at various opportunities, really trying to raise this lens of the importance of primary prevention of war and militarism without luck. And I think, part of what we've highlighted in our work too is just recognizing that the Department of Defense itself is a major funder of universities, of public health research. And so there's like this sort of built-in conflict of interest that we contend with when it comes to asking different kinds of questions, those that aren't necessarily vetted or funded through particularly, federal and really private as well, and other funding streams for public health knowledge production.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question from Chris asking whether the speakers could all share what additional services, especially healthcare services, are needed to help refugees and victims in war zones.
I mean, I think the easy answer, there's an easy answer there that like, at least outside of the United States, there's so much that is needed, and there's just not nearly enough funding for the number of people that are out there. And when we do provide services, they're kind of at a bare minimum, like 15 liters of water per person per day or something. But I think what's really missing is the political will to do anything about it. And I think that's what we all work on, sort of, in one way or another. And really educating more folks on that, I hope, changes that dynamic.
Do you have any other thoughts?
I'd just say briefly, they need access to all the same services that everyone who's not in the war zone needs. So kids in war zones still need to somehow be educated. People need means of communication so they can reach their family members and others who are displaced. That's one of the major ones that we often forget about. It's very difficult for people to find each other after the fact. But just think of people's day-to-day lives. And that's what they need.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have a question from Mark about COVID and refugees, how it's being tracked. Mark, are you still on? Do you want to preface your question? You referenced some context, I think. If not, I have a slate of questions here from him about how refugees, for example, the estimate.
Yeah, I'm on now. I think. I just wanted to know what is being done in terms of COVID with the Ukraine refugees. Is there any tracking? Is there any protection? Is there any vaccination? I have seen no reports whatsoever on COVID from the Ukraine and the war that's going on now.
Mark, what geographic context are you talking about? Are you talking about in the area around Ukraine, in the U.S.?
I'm talking about the refugees. I mean, that's what the panel's about. So the refugees are going to Poland, they're going to Germany, they're going to France. Ostensibly, some are coming to the United States. I have seen nothing about the specific situation with COVID. Nothing about healthcare, nothing about very little about refugee, what's going on with the refugees from Ukraine. I know that there are a lot of them, or I've heard that there are a lot of them.
There are, and I think what's happening mostly is they're getting integrated into national context. That's why I was asking where you were thinking of specifically. So it differs by context. I don't think UNHCR is looking broadly for every Ukrainian refugee around the world and asking what their COVID status is. But I'm just guessing that the Polish health system for people who are coming in is trying to get a handle, are they vaccinated or not. In the US, Ukrainians are coming through the standard refugee resettlement program. As Catherine mentioned, not everyone in refugee resettlement is a refugee. A lot of people have new terms we didn't used to think about, like parolee and things like that. But as part of the program, when Ukrainians get resettled in the US or are facilitated, one of the things we look at is making sure they are getting vaccinated against COVID. One of the other big ones, which is also a big concern, is, and importantly so, making sure they're getting screened for TB. So I can't speak to every country where they are, but I know in the US, where I feel pretty confident that most of the Ukrainians are getting into the healthcare system more than other refugees, that they're getting screened and vaccinated.
But UNHCR is, to your knowledge, is not doing much with this. Is not tracking this in any kind of way.
Not that I know of. I don't know about it
neither is
specifically.
WHO or anybody like that.
I don't think so. Again, I think it's all at the national level, and these people get embedded into the national view wherever they are. That's my understanding of it, but I haven't looked at it specifically.
Catherine, did you want to jump in?
Sure. This is more in the U.S. context because that's where HHS is. And so on the unaccompanied children side, for those who are in the care of HHS, the unaccompanied children do receive vaccines and regular testing through the HHS system.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Kathleen about how are we doing with getting U.S. detained children from Mexican parents back to their families?
I wonder, Catherine, you probably could give us the most up-to-date information here. I mean, I think my sense of it is that, yes, a task force has been created to reunite children, but the timeline of that, given how long some children were separated from their parents, means that there are many parents who are in essence lost to follow up, to use a real euphemism of research. But, in essence, there are still hundreds of children who have not been reunited with their parents. And I think this sort of speaks to the conditions in which folks have been turned back at the border, particularly over the period of COVID. It was a lot of chaos. There were a lot of folks turned back at points of entry where they did not cross in the first place. So it was unfamiliar territory, often turned back without whatever they were traveling with, including identifications, money, and whatever belongings they might have been carrying. So this is a highly complex project to try to reunite children years later at this point. And given some of the dangers that arose in some of the ports of entry, Juarez in particular was one that was covered a lot in terms of a lot of the dangers, including of trafficking, as folks, for instance, along the Arizona border were pushed east toward Texas to another space and port of entry. But I can speak from my knowledge of a lot of colleagues who were working in that space and on ground that it was impossible for the shelters to keep up with the demand during that period.
Yeah, and just to reinforce, it is an active, ongoing process, collaboration from within the federal government as well as community-based organizations.
Well, thank you. We have a few more questions to squeeze in before we close. Catherine asks, how does everyone feel that the more sympathetic views on Ukraine refugees will, or if, transfer to other current or future refugees of war?
I think that's an interesting and complicated question. On the one hand, there's this like massive race component to it that we can't ignore. And on the other hand, like there are war refugees that I have enormous sympathy for, just like everybody else. And I think sort of balancing that with massive refugee populations all over the brown and black parts of the world, it just highlights like how big the problem is and how we have a really myopic view of what we were willing to do about it.
I would agree with Rohini. There's definitely a significant element of race which is not spoken of. We hear about it in Central Europe, especially, where you have Afghan, Syrian, Sudanese, on the border, getting essentially pushed back with pitchforks into other territories, while the Ukrainians are being welcomed. And we all want the Ukrainians to be welcomed, but we want the other folks to be welcomed as well. So I'm not confident that the goodwill towards Ukrainians will carry over to everyone else. I was very pleased with the reception to Afghans in many parts of the country. But what it left me feeling was, what about the Haitians, which no one speaks about? So it's hard not to look at that and see the stark difference, not just in the public perception, but in how our government perceives these folks and what different categories they get put into. I can get Ukrainians transportation to their visits. I can't get Haitians transportation to their visits. So a very large discussion to be had around this, but not a new issue. It's just sort of coming home to us in a way that it hasn't before.
Thank you. I'm going to see if we can squeeze in one last question. Do any of the speakers know of opportunities that specifically help climate refugees, which is not a recognized term by the UN? Many of these people are also in conflict zones. And of course, there's a great deal of overlap.
I think maybe in at least in the United States, if you think of it as Amy mentioned, as IDPs of natural disaster, then I can see lots of resources, at least FEMA or whatever, for whatever that's worth, coming in when it comes to wildfires in California or hurricanes and things like that. So in that sense, like folks who are displaced by natural disasters that are probably climate-based, have resources in the United States. Abroad, it's just, as a researcher, I'll say there's just so many confounders, and it's such a complex playing field that it's really hard to dissect like what's a climate refugee versus war or disaster or something else. And so that lack of definition or trying to push it into a climate framework, I don't know if that's doing that much help.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not aware of any or sort of any differential treatments as that would pertain to the border and circumstances of migration and immigration. I think, you know, it's important though to recognize that, like, yeah, as you said, Dr. Hard, like thinking about how that framing might help us understand at least the circumstances of the push factors, which will be more, right? We know because of the way we're running our global economy and where we're headed in terms of what's coming with future waves of need.
Thank you so much to our speakers for your input, and we really appreciate your time here and sharing your essential experiences and expertise. Because of the time, I'm going to go ahead and move us to a closing so we can get out of here around 11:30 Pacific. Here are a few ways to engage with us. We've been tweeting a few resources, links, etc. on the Peace Caucus and Human Rights Twitter accounts. You can also join the Human Rights Forum if you are an APHA member at lead.apha.org for more discussion. The APHA Peace Caucus also has a website there at aphapeacecaucus.org. Both of us are always looking for new members and friends, lots of ways to get involved with program development, future webinars like this, policy, communications, membership and fundraising activities. Both are volunteer driven, so all hands on deck. You can also join us at the APHA National Meeting in November. Here's a slate of Human Rights and Peace Caucus sessions. Of course, all focused on the intersection of human rights, peace, primary prevention, etc. Pasting a link now into the chat if you want to look in more depth at that schedule. And these last few slides will also be posted on our Twitter account shortly. Thank you all again for attending and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.